Chris Gleason is the founder and CEO of Simplicity Tax Loans and RAM Financial Group. Collectively, the companies serve property owners and local governments nationwide by offering affordable financing for property tax debt. Chris has an MBA in financial planning and has always desired to help people by creating solutions to navigate complex systems. Congratulations for publishing your article in Authority magazine. It's titled 5 Effective Strategies for Mental Well-Being. The reason you wrote the article is because of your own history suffering from anxiety. How did your childhood contribute to setting you up sort of to be an anxious person?
Mm, yeah, I think in my childhood that a lot of things were assigned a lot of importance. And I developed a very strong sense that life was always kind of teetering in the balance, if you will, right? And everything was so fragile that it kind of made me a little bit hyper vigilant to make sure that I always managed my life very, very well. And that was sort of ingrained in me from a very young age, and that was just something that I was taught, not just only by my parents, but I think the world taught me that as well, and my environment taught me. So I learned to manage a lot of things and try to hold a lot of things where I felt they were supposed to be. And when it felt like things were out of control, it was generally anxiety provoking. And especially as an adult, I recognized that I was sort of that was a learned behavior for me.
Would you label it perfectionism, like everything had to be exactly right? Or does
Definitely an element of that.
okay,
Definitely an element of that. And I always, as I've sort of examined myself, there's both a nature and a nurture element to it.
yes.
And I do think that I am the type of person that's wired towards perfectionism, but
Hmm.
my nurturing also sort of exasperated that perfectionism as well. So that holding and controlling was certainly a part of that. And as an adult, I've had to unlearn perfectionism, and on the other side, really learn to embrace failure and the imperfect, and even see the beauty in the imperfect.
A little bit more accepting of the process of learning rather than the outcome. When did anxiety become a real crisis for you?
I'd say it became a crisis as an adult. In childhood, I was able to hold and manage and exert the energy that anxiety naturally kind of draws out of you. As an adult, and as I got older, and I had more responsibility, and especially after I had kids of my own, and I was responsible not just for my own energy but for theirs, that's when it became overwhelming. Trying to manage, recognizing that I was always managing my own life on the brink of a breakdown, right? I was always just under the surface. It was always just under the surface.
Yeah.
And then once I had a family and all of that, it just became too much. That managing holding down a job, owning my own business, way too much.
You mentioned during that time that you felt as though you lost your own identity. Why is that?
Mm. I think anxiety, for me at least, was definitely became a process of it became a process or became a form of survival, right? When you're anxious, your creativity, your desires, your natural desires, natural inclination toward desire, um, your drive, all of those things take a back seat to
Yes.
to surviving. And so I think that who I understand myself to be today, that person was not functioning when I was anxious.
Hmm.
I was just trying to get from point A to point B all of the time. And so, when I talk about identity today, it's like there's so many more things I could tell you about myself that make me uniquely who I am, but none of those things could function. And so I think that I was more or less lost in this constant washing machine of anxiety.
When you're trying to avoid being eaten by a tiger, it's pretty hard to be creative, right?
That is correct. Except in creative ways to get away from that tiger. Yeah, but that's about it.
How long did that season of intense anxiety last?
Years, years. I would say if I had to put a number on it, I would say 3 or 4 years. And again, my story was, my very, very intense anxiety was triggered by an acute event. So that's kind of unique in my scenario, um, but I would say it took me 3 or 4 years to really feel like I was on the other side of it and sort of regaining control of myself, or a felt control, or ability to exist as I now understand myself to be, and to maybe basically enjoy my life. It was probably 4 years.
That's a long time to be running from the tiger, isn't it?
It is. It is. It's exhausting.
Exhausting. What were
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
main strategies that helped you through that dark time to pull out of it?
I think some of the main strategies were actually very vulnerable and uh, embracing the fact that what I needed to do felt like things that I previously would have only ascribed to weak people.
I see.
Waking up and um, just concentrating on my breathing. Because I woke up every morning feeling like my lungs were only half full of air, and feeling like I needed to be intentional about sort of taking in deep breaths before I started my day.
Mhm.
Um, in my case, meditation and prayer, and being very, very intentional and almost obedient to having that intentional time every single morning before I got going. Leaning deeply into relationships in ways that I hadn't previously, and being honest about what I was experiencing and what I was feeling, and also being honest with myself about what I couldn't do was
Yes.
very, very hard. However, I think those things were critical in sort of what I'll call my healing process, I guess, over the course of those 4 years, to
Yeah.
where my capacity to engage with things had to start from that foundation and then could expand from there. And it took a very, very long time, but feeling like my capacity was reduced, and acknowledging there were things that I could not do, felt like embracing weakness, embracing my own vulnerability, and the reality that that's where I was, and just accepting that this is where I am, and living fully into that.
So you mentioned vulnerability. It must have been extremely vulnerable to adopt practices that previously you associated with wimps. Is that right?
That's
Okay.
pretty much right. I think there was a general sense of you look at someone who's struggling, or who, especially because I'm sort of more of a high achieving type personality, you look at people who can't and you go, well, why can't you?
Yeah.
Just do it. Just make the choice.
Yes.
And then you land in this pool of anxiety, and you recognize, oh, that's why they're not choosing. Because all
Yeah.
of a sudden I find myself unable to choose. I can't. It's not a choice. The
A
choices
very
become smaller, littler things,
moment by moment,
baby steps.
very strenuous process that you went through to gain the level of peace that you have now. Contrary to what most people believe, you've noticed that seasons of stress don't necessarily create anxiety. In fact, sometimes it appears there's no immediate cause for feeling anxious. Tell us about that.
Yeah. I think in examining my own anxiety, and of course talking with all kinds of other people that have anxiety too, one of the consistent themes is I'm just anxious. I I
Yes.
and you say, well, why are you anxious? And I know what it's like to be in the middle of that. I don't know. I don't know why I'm anxious.
Yeah.
Maybe something triggered it, but something is going on in my brain or in my soul, in my person, that feels at odds with something, and I don't really know why. And so I think that what I've noticed is that was a very consistent theme for me when I was anxious. Sometimes I could point to something, but not always. It almost felt like it felt like a way of existing. I was just existing as an anxious person, and it would crop up sometimes. I never quite knew why. But at the same time, I also now recognize that there are things that I engage in now that certainly would have been major stressors in the past. And having gone through this very difficult season of anxiety, a very, very difficult season of immense failure, and kind of being in a space that I wasn't used to, there's suddenly a new capacity to take on and deal with stress where things are stressors, but they don't necessarily stress me. Um, so there's just this interesting dynamic at play between anxiety and stress, where I just don't necessarily relate the two anymore, and it feels like what's going on externally that would be a stressor doesn't necessarily become internal anxiety to me anymore. I'm able to separate the two.
Gosh, what a victory for you to be able to separate those two. I mean, that's amazing. For many, anxiety creates an urgency to do more, try harder, be better, but you've learned to do the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about that.
And I don't know that I can take credit for it, really. It's not anything that I did. I think number one, having some of my worst fears come to pass was really, really helpful. I don't think anybody wants to hear that, but the reality is that the things that I was trying to control got so far outside of my control that I had to learn to just surrender my desire to keep things where they were. And that was a form of breaking that I couldn't have manufactured myself.
Yes. It sounds like it was liberating to face what you considered failure at the time.
Mm-hmm. 100%. And there's this, I have almost have this visual of, my anxious self with clenched fists and the stress of that clenching. And for whatever reason, our brains sort of translate as all we have to do is clench harder,
Yes.
and then it will be okay. Yet the answer is actually relaxing and releasing those clenched fists, which feels scary
Right.
because those fists were clenched as a form of defense against something known or unknown. Um, Yet we find that we don't actually have to protect ourselves from all those things, and we're actually okay when we relax into allowing. Allowing was a big word for me when I was learning to be okay. Allow things to happen, even when my brain says that's not right. Allow it.
It's almost what I'm hearing. Maybe one way of saying what I'm hearing is that you had to change your brain's belief. You had to override your brain's belief that clenching was what would make you safe, when in reality it was relaxing that gave you safety.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
You've also noticed that light to moderate anxiety is simply the result of trying to accomplish a hard or significant task. So, light anxiety is stimulating to creativity. So, what do you do when feeling excessive stress?
Yeah, these days, like, yeah, and obviously excessive stress is probably different for everybody. I know what it is for me.
Yes.
And I know that when I enter that territory of excessive stress, it probably means that I'm going back to old patterns.
Hmm.
And It's easy to blame your environment, but in reality, you're the only one
Yeah,
that can make choices in those.
unfortunately. Yeah.
The world will not bend to our feelings
Hmm.
as much as we want it to. And so I stop. I stop. And what I've learned for myself is I have to take a moment to examine, is this because I'm speeding up again? As I've learned to sort of embrace a sort of a slower pace of life, at least internally in the way that I approach things. And that's understanding my own wiring and who I am and how I need to approach everything that's in my own life. I stop and I pause and I remind myself that everything can wait. Everything can wait a minute. There are very few things in life that can't wait a minute. And so I just take a moment for self-examination. You know, what is happening right now? What am I experiencing? What am I becoming so worried about? You know,
Mhm.
what am I stressing over? And maybe sometimes it takes talking to someone, because I'm not always a very good judge of what's going on with me. Yet other people are able to see me much more accurately. And so I'll take time to even allow others to reflect for me
Yeah,
what they see going on with me.
that leads right into the next statement that caught my attention in your article. You said anxiety is an invitation to embrace reality. What did you mean?
um, I think that in my case, my anxious self and my desire to control, um, at least part of what was underlying my anxiety and my way of existing in this world was a constant attempt to write my own story,
Mm-hmm.
to make sure that the story that I had already mapped out for myself and my life and my brain would come to pass. And anxiety sometimes feels like being at odds with what is actually going on in my world, and embracing the fact that the things that I don't want to, that I have not written into my story, things like grief and loss. And in my brain, I wanted to live in a world that was risk free, where bad things don't happen to me, where I don't have very, very difficult, the very natural difficulty of relationships, and the fact that they're not all perfect. And sometimes they result in conflict. There were so many things that I was avoiding without even knowing. I was avoiding acknowledging that those things are a part of my reality. They're a part of my world. They're a part of life. And I was ill-equipped too. I would actually say I was fairly emotionally unintelligent
Mm-hmm.
um, when I was anxious. And the more that I was exposed, especially to emotionally intelligent people, wise people who are able to kind of help me understand the things that were going on in my world and the way that I was experiencing them, the more I realized, gosh, I was barely half living in reality.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I meant by it. And I don't know if that'll make sense for everyone, but there's a lot I didn't understand when I look back. Um, Having an understanding of those things now is extremely liberating, to use that word.
It seems to be part of our human condition living this life on earth that it is so hard to accept that there are things that happen that we have no control over. You know, every human being has those times when an event enters our life that we didn't plan and didn't want. You've noticed that anxiety thrives in isolation, and you touched on this a minute ago. So, is part of the cure or the effective cure of anxiety making a deliberate connection with someone else?
I think so. At the very least, it's about making yourself available for relationship. I mean, I think one of the things that was really striking to me as I kind of looked around for solutions to my own anxiety is to recognize that, first of all, anxiety has not ever been as prevalent in
Yes.
society as it is now, right? And I think that fact alone made me go, well, why is that?
Yeah.
Anxiety is not as prevalent in other cultures. Why
Yeah.
is that? And so that, to me, at least from a scientific approach, says there's something about the way we live that breeds anxiety. Um, and discovering that, at least in part, a big part of the way that our society is moving is towards greater and greater individualism,
Yeah.
greater autonomy, self-reliance, things of that nature. And so to recognize that the way that I naturally live, simply because of where I've grown up and what I've experienced for 40 plus years, is is in effect a form of isolation, and almost a glorification of isolation and
Mm.
self-reliance. And so I've had to learn how to, and I'm still learning how to invest deeply in relationship and how to actually engage in very open, honest, intimate relationship with others. And like clockwork, I find that the more I press into that, the more my anxiety can't exist.
Yeah.
It can't. I can't feel anxious
Yeah.
because I always feel like I'm connected and supported, regardless of what's going on around me. Right? It's a bizarre thing. Whereas I normally would have assigned, oh, the reason I feel anxious is because I'm worried about running out of money. It's actually not what I'm worried about. I'm worried about being alone and out in the cold, you
Yes.
know. Yet when we're together, when we see ourselves as a collective, we don't feel as open and vulnerable to whatever may come along because we know that there are others who will jump in and support us. And only in relationship can we actually feel that as much as we may know it in our mind.
I think we're designed to function in community.
Mm,
And you're right. In today's world, it has pushed us into separate little corners. And
hmm
it takes more deliberate effort to create or take part in community and in relationships than it used to.
hmm
There are so many wise tips in the written article. I urge anyone who's listening to this interview to go to Authority Magazine and read the entire article. It's called Five Effective Strategies for Well-Being by Chris Gleason. Thank you so much for spending a few minutes with me today. I appreciate your expansion on the tips that you provided in the written article. I know there'll be many people that will find them helpful.
Oh, my pleasure, Nancy. Thanks so much to you too.